youngest child in the family with 3 older sisters. And maybe living with 3 females would help him later in his own life. Ernie entered the Air Force as a National Service pilot in 1951. One of his first aviation skills recorded in his logbook is clearance to hand swing a Tiger Moth, an essential qualification for cadet pilots in the 1950s. Later that year, Ernie found himself in Canada on the shores of Lake Winnipeg, RAF, Royal Canadian Air Force Base, Gimli. But this initial training on harbours was cut short, unfortunately, due to a mid-air collision. Nothing to do with Ernie, Ernie was an instrument flying trip. And they recovered, and you'll see some of the wreckage, but how they managed actually to recover Ernie and the instructor. It was amazing. The instructor never flew again, and Ernie was in hospital for a year. He was carried back to the UK and did his convalescence back in Greenford. Once he was declared A1G1Z1, he returned to complete his initial pilot training at Gimli for another transatlantic trip to undertake advanced pilot training. This is the National Service. And he flew the Meteors and the Vampires back in the UK. And with like so many people who did National Service, he just left the Air Force at the end of his time. And then, as some people would put it, he got a proper job with Gillette on the sales team. And I guess you could say he put him at the sharp end of the business. What his participation is essential. So can we have a load of grounds? Obviously, his desire to fly remained with Ernie, and he successfully applied to join 501 Squadron, City of Bristol, in the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, flying Vampires again, FP5s this time, with guns. So he was a fighter pilot, a genuine fighter pilot. This, of course, entailed many weekend journeys to and from Filton, and there were tales of 501 Squadron members flying under the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Whenever we would ask Ernie about this, he would neither confirm nor deny. Sadly, in 1957, the Defence Review disbanded the Royal Auxiliary Air Force flying units with a great reduction in the fighter force. Ernie was born to be a pilot, and it comes as no surprise that the routines of civil work were not for him. After further time with Gillette, and a short period of work in the Courts of Protection, he applied to join the regular Air Force. Between 1959 and 1962, gosh, this is deep history, isn't it? It was very, very hectic for Ernst. He married Edna, rejoined the Air Force, completed flying refresher training, did the MOTU course, that's the Maritime Operational Training Unit, which is where you train for the Shackleton aircrew. My memory serves me right. Oh, and of course, Donna and Linda were born. Oh, and then the whole family moved to Northern Ireland. We joined 204 Squadron. Fish! I was looking for somebody from 204 Squadron. So you can confirm that he joined Bill Holdsworth's crew. Yay! Bill Holdsworth was known for his love of long flights. And one of his catchphrase was, the sooner we get airborne, the longer we can do.
About Ernie. My first flight with Ernie was an 11 o'clock takeoff on the 23rd of August 1963. Oof. And we were doing mandatory
pilot training.
And we did it for about 3 hours.
Great, well there we go, that's where it starts.
And then 2 weeks later he took me down to Gibraltar.
Terrific. Great, so there's the start of the connection with maritime flying. It's this guy, Bill Holdsworth, was a bit of a legend in his own time, and it would appear officially that they flew the Shackleton Mark II for 24 hours and 36 minutes. Now, where's Bill Spate? Could you explain to me, Flight Engineer Spate, why you do that and don't crash? The mixture must have been so weak and the propellers going around so slowly. That's true. Oh, yeah, it's smashing. That's unbelievable. And 1 tank of fuel. Just 2 days in your life. Anyway, Ernie moved on before Bill Holsworth had his most famous experience, which was when he bounced off the water one night. Wiped the radar scanner off the bottom of Shackleton and nearly drowned the guy in the back of the aeroplane. But landed safely. Apocryphal stories. Then he moved on to 38 Squadron in Malta.
Yeah.
And here we have quite a few members. There must be at least 2 people on 38 Squadron. But I think Pete Hotwood will probably step in now and tell us some real stories about 38 Squadron in Malta. Peter.
Thank you, Mike. I didn't hear very much of that, but I'm going to shout.
Because we all flew Shackleton.
I did write some copious notes, but I've summarised them I was a very small part of Ernie's military life, really, but he was a very big part of mine, I must say. I was lucky enough to be posted to 38 Squadron, and I was posted to Crew 2, who had a bit of a reputation, I gather, but I was to be the co-pilot on Crew 2 of 38 Squadron. A great deal sitting in the other seat next to an expert like he finished up breaking his right arm, so I thought, this is strange, this is a new swan. Ernie said, it's not always like this. So, he took me under his wing, and we spent really a very exciting year and a very demanding year, I think. We were away in Madagascar for probably the best part of 5 months. We went up to Balaxa and helped out 37 Squadron sometimes whilst they were looking after Majunga. And we also did a very great deal of flying. One particular occasion which I will report, and that was, well, first of all, I'll just mention one event. My apologies for anybody who was at Ernie's 75th birthday, because I recounted this story there, but I'll briefly mention it. Ernie had some problems when he was out in Malta, not serious ones, but he needed to go back to London to the central medical setup there. We were always told, don't go there if you can possibly avoid it, because they'll look at everything. So Ernie went there. He had a bit of trouble with his asteroids. So he went up to London, and after about a week he came back, and the crew were waiting to greet him, and we could see he wasn't limping anymore, but he looked different, and in fact he came back wearing spectacles. So we remarked, I remember some of the crew members saying, wow, what they can do with those little cameras these days. So from then on, seemed to be wearing spectacles. I will recount one war story which summarises Ernie, I think. We had an engine failure, and very fortunately some liquid was spotted being leaked from the number 3 engine by one of our Cs looking out of the windows, and he reported that there was some fluid flowing off the wing, and we looked at the gauges, and the number 3 engine gauge started to flicker, and Ernie very quickly took control of the situation, shut down the engine, and we climbed safely away. And we were a bit concerned because we were nearer to Durban in South Africa than we were to Majunga in Madagascar. And Ernie had to make the decision: did we become a diplomatic incident and land in Durban, where probably the local authorities were not really on our side in that viral patrol set up. So the decision early May was that we would spend about 2.5 hours back to Majunga, and the number 3 engine was wandering gently up and down on the left-hand side, and we got it back on the ground anyway. And we discovered then that the engine bearer, the big mounting, had come out of drift from the airframe, and so the engine was being supported only very vaguely. So, but that, I think, typified the way that you looked at a situation like that. You would summarise what was going on, make a decision, stick by it. Everybody followed him because we had the utmost faith in his experience and his attitude to flying and to looking after a crew. So my memories of Ernie are he was a very, very capable, very efficient, and a joy to fly with, and definitely one to party with. I must just mention that one of our navigators was Alan Goss. So he was on our crew in Malta, and it is reputed that his wife, his lovely wife Pam, only found out after 6 months of Alan being on 38 Squadron that we finished work at lunchtime. That is the sort of crew that we had. And he was very much
Great. Thanks, Peter. Legion's more stories of 38 Squadron that people have very, very kindly actually given me. And talking to all these people around here has been a real experience, because there's no doubt about it that the older we get, the better we were. Ernst was always above us, that's for sure. So when he left the Shackletons and went to the Central Flying School, great fun experience. He was posted to the School of Refresher Flying training on the jet bombs, which has got to be the best tour you can do as a jet flying instructor. It's super, because you don't deal with basic students, you deal with people who can fly and want to go back to the front line. And it's all fun flying, low flying, aerobatics, great stuff. The faster the better, the lower the better. And if you've got somebody with you, it's even more fun. So he did the tour there, and his aerobatics were noted. Now, I believe there are 2 people from RFS here. Is that right?
Yes.
Ah! Right here. Would you like to, sir? Are you Mr.
Peter Dickens.
Peter?
I wasn't planning to say anything today, but I was prevailed upon by daughters. So all I can
Can't believe that.
all I can do is to read something that I had written and sent to him on his 75th birthday, which I wasn't able to attend. So I'll be brief, but and of course this is from 2007. Dear Ernie, I'm sorry not to be able to share your day. Previously booked and unchangeable overseas holiday arrangements made it impossible. I hear there may not be many representatives from Manby Day, so I can just remind you and tell the others of your spell on the staff of the refresher school. It was a single engine jet. We had no navigators, engineers, or any other human assistance on board, and yet we still managed to find our way home and do things without problems. You were the flight commander of 3 Squadron when I arrived in 1970, and out of all the 15 or so staff, it was obviously you were the most experienced and respected pilot on the outfit. And after our first trip together, I knew why. You could make the aircraft do anything you wanted. We did fly together once or twice, where I really tried and usually failed to be as smooth and accurate as as you. But we did once go to Strubby, from Strubby and over to Cranwell for our 6 monthly dinghy drill refreshers. And so I flew it on the way, trying my best to be as good as possible. And he flew on the way back. And he was all over the place, relatively. I said, Ernie, when we got down, I said, what was going on? What was your problem? And he said, I had made him feel nervous because I seemed to have really got the hang of the Jack Frost. And this is ridiculous. He was he was just brilliant. I watched him for 3 years, tactfully supporting our squadron commanders, leading your staff pilots, organising the very fluid daily flying programme, and effortlessly turning potential disasters into mere manageable difficulties. You handled a whole range of students, from RAF group captains to Kuwaiti second lieutenants, from the brash to the underconfident, each with a varying appropriate mix of firmness and humour. You may be feeling a trifle embarrassed by now. That's because you are a modest professional and all-round nice bloke. You've been a role model to many, and I'm fortunate to have been one of them. We shall miss you.
Can I add to that while he was there, he won the Wright Jubilee Aeros Trophy, I believe. And a colleague of yours, Keith Walters, asked him, having only won the trophy, he said, well, how do you do this thing called the square loop? Well, that's my know a little bit about square loops, but basically it's a definite loop, which really is performed by aeroplanes with high performance and plenty of power, that's for sure. At one stage, you do a vertical dive, and he was asked, how do you judge the moment at which you pull out from the dive? Because all the instruments are doing different things, they're not all telling lies. He said, I'll wait till I'm absolutely petrified, then I count to 5, and then I pull as hard as I can. It seems to work anyway. Later. At that time, he also became a lifelong friend with Brian Hoskins, who went on to lead the Red Arrows during the first time that Ernie was in the straight pilot of the Nimrod. And then at the end of the time at his tour at CFS, at Refresher Flying Squadron, he got another tour. So he did 2 tours there. A lucky man, golden ticket. He then moved on to 42, having completed number 22 Nimrod course in 1972. And I think Pete Dawson might just tell us a little story of his first days on the OCU, having been on 42. Pete?
Never on 42.
No, on the OCU. Yeah. Days on the OCU.
Yeah, I've got a couple of quick tips. We used to do Eagle. Was the boss of the OCU at the time, and we used to do a tri-national symposium, Canadians, Americans and ourselves, of the OCU staff, and we went to Jacksonville, VP30. It was actually a holiday for Chris Monquist, because he was posted there. He wanted to go find a house, and there was the lights of Tony Deere and stuff. And on the way back, we called in Greenwood to night stop before coming back here this morning. Well, as Sod's Law would have it, on the morning we got up, the whole of the south of England was out with fog. So we actually got airborne, holding somewhere like Wilderath as a diversion, which meant a lot more fuel to hold for the diversion. And Ernie was the captain, and we came back, went past the point of no return, by which time everywhere in the UK except St Morgan had opened up. so we could now hold line, which meant we had stacks of fuel. We got back here, came in and did the first approach, and it was fog on the way down. Typical. So as he went round for, I think, a visual circuit, Ernie sort of announced to the crew that he was going to have another go at this. And we, of course, we were all ICU staff. We were all going, so Ernie said, and someone must have asked, but what makes it different? He said, well, I remember this about 14 years ago. He said, I came down here in some aircraft. He said, and it was just like this, the weather. He said, it came down, but it was a propeller aircraft, and it blew all the fog away. He said, and the second time we came in, and it was perfect. Round we came, and it was like going into the Blackwall Tunnel. It was those parting seas of Jericho, and that was it. In we went, landed in the Strasbourg. So I learned about Ernie's ability to not only fly an aeroplane, but he knew the map very well as well. And another occasion, my shortest trip ever in the Air Force, Ernie was doing the display final practice here at St Morgan in the Nimrod, and all the execs were in the tower to get him his final clearance so he could go off and do the display. And I had a want of sort of standing behind the pilots. Might have been something to do with the fact that I used to fly with Ian Gillespie, Gaspar, Malcolm Ruff and Brian Essex, and I had to stand behind the I was the only one who could see over the combing. So we got airborne and on the northwesterly runway, and Ernie aggressively turned, and I lived near the Airways pub, and we turned and we were almost downwind by the time we got there. And just after that we got a message with the aircraft, please return to land and return to base, and we'd like to see the captain in ops. He'd done quite an aggressive turn. I would call it a wing over, line and a half, as he came around the corner there. So I came to the conclusion, as an aside to that, and I timed that whole sortie as 5.5 minutes. But I then found out that God in fact was a pilot, because by the time it had got the authorisation sheets with the times in, it had gone up to 15 minutes. The pilots had filled it in, and it had gone from 5.5 minutes to 15 minutes. And so the reason I think that God is a pilot, because I'm actually only 47, but God looks after the authorisation sheets, and I'm actually getting into the mid-70s.
There's another great story which would go on for some time about it. It involves Ernst and the OCU crew about the same time. In fact, Mike Norris tells me it was on the 1st of July 1978. And Mike was part of Ernie's display crew for that particular show. And Malcolm Ruff was sitting next to us, and he obviously couldn't see out. And Bill Spake, we thought was the engineer, but he was refusing to acknowledge this. Jim Cripp was on board, and Mick Young, and a guy called Matt McDonald, and Reg Pears, of course. And they were due to go do a show, 2 shows, one at Plymouth and one at Halton, which you know is near Aylesbury. Anyway, the weather was rather like Pete's described it, awful, all over the UK. But Ernst, never scrub on a forecast, had spoken to his old mate Brian Hoskins, who's leading the Red Arrows, and said, yeah, we're going to give it a whirl, it's okay. So this conversation went on before the crew briefing took place. So Ernst told them, the sparrows are going, so are we. Well, they did. They went to Plymouth. All they could see were cranes sticking out the top of the fog over the harbour. They went off to the middle of England. Got lots of help from radar and instrument landing system. And Mike Norris standing between the navigators with a map and a stopwatch. And got them to Halton to discover that they were the only aircraft that had turned up for the air display that day. And guess what? Only did a very nice display. But it doesn't stop there, because this aeroplane had a bit of a malfunction before it took off, and wouldn't pressurise. But so that they would actually stick on the schedule, Jim Davis came up with an answer and put a saucepan on the top of the launcher, which was the cause of the problem. So they were actually relying on a saucepan to get airborne. Well, they're still airborne. You come back to St Morgan, and same sort of weather, only they didn't get in that time, and they ended up at Lynham. And at Lynham, well, they spent the night, refueled, tried the next day, had a couple of goes here, by which time Lynham was out of weather conditions. So they went to Leeming. So they left Leeming the following morning, with the saucepan in place, a bit of launcher, came back, still no joy. And eventually, they went back to Leeming for a second night. So on the 5th day of this epic, this 4-hour trip that was scheduled, on the 5th day, they eventually got back to St Morgan. But Alton got its air display. After a hectic time on the OCU, Ernie was given a rest tour on 51 Squadron, which he decided that he really enjoyed too much. Actually, he didn't really need a rest. So, by the merest of chance, 18 Group said, we need somebody on the GS unit. So the Group Standards unit, they are the checkers of the checkers. So Ernie volunteered for that, so kept him in Cornwall, delighted with that. And within, I think, about 6 months, Terry, they moved up to Kinross. Not part of the plan at all. However, the Falklands cropped up in 82, when Ernst was on GSU, and Ernst played a major part, along with Terry, to train all the pilots for the new roles that were associated with that particular conflict. So if Terry would have give us a few words about Ernie's participation in the air-to-air refuelling program, then that would be terrific. And tell us a little bit about 1,000-pound bombing, maybe.
You don't need to know about that. I've given up being a hooligan. My hooliganism today was the last bit, possibly. Yeah, where do I start? Conclusion at the beginning. Ernie was quite one of the nicest guys I ever worked with in the Air Force. And it's been a great honour today to have sprinkled some ashes in an appropriate place in his memory. We can't necessarily declare where that is. I assure you it's appropriate, and I only got... yes, today was good, and it's great to concentrate the mind thinking about such a nice guy. I was running the GSU at the time Ernie joined it, down at St Morgan, and my wife was thrilled to have a quarter in Padstow. Everything was wonderful. And then a friend of mine at the time, some of you might know, Brian Johnson, was my boss at 18 Group, and he said, look Terry, it's daft being down there. There are 3 squadrons up at Kinloss, 1 squadron, GSU's got to move. It was nearly a divorce. And it wasn't the best thing that ever happened to Ernie, but off we went. And by that time I realised that much as I liked Ernie, we were different personalities. I was a bossy Nimrod captain, okay, drop your son boy, do this and all that. And he just sat there and flew the aeroplane beautifully. So initially we didn't sort of link. But then we got a little short jolly, weekend jolly, out to Cyprus. And with the whole team of the GSU, memories here, but certainly we had Paddy Taylor with us, one would remember. So we ended up in a few bars. And we had a great time, and we flew back fairly quietly. We ended up on the instrument approach, going into Kinloss, with Ernie and I sitting up there in fits of laughter. I had no idea what we were laughing about, but from that moment on, we had, a very good relationship. Slightly sad. I would love to be able to tell you more about, his his demonstration of his lovely flying talents by air-to-air refueling. But when the Falklands blew up, they said, Ernie, I forget how it was decided, but he was a natural to be put into the seat to learn how to do air refueling and then to teach it, which he did brilliantly. Meanwhile, they said, you can go off and do 1,000-pound bombing and fighter evasion stuff, which was far less dramatic, well, slightly dramatic. But anyway, Ernie was terrific at doing that. Now, at that time, although I did refueling later, I wasn't involved, but Donna sent me his logbook for May, I forget it was the 1st or 2nd, well sorry, May, yeah, the May logbook, during which he flew 94 hours, almost like every day, sorties 3 to 4 hours at a time, and was listing all these pilots that he'd had with him on those flights for training. The only one that I've got straightforward contact with at the moment was Jock Wingate, you may remember. Lovely guy, and I talked to him about it, and most of his tanking memories were associated with operations around there. So I didn't get any stories about Ernie from that time. Donna and I have both tried to get a copy of the citation he got, but we failed on that. So all I know is that in the way he was and the skills he had, he would have been brilliant at teaching people air-to-air refueling, for which he thoroughly deserved having an Air Force Cross. And he was a super guy.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you very much. Well, there are lots of stories about the people who did the tanking. The most impressive statistic about the whole thing is nobody failed the course. And it's not easy. I didn't do any tanking, unfortunately, but I was on the trip. There's a Vulcan that appears on here. And I was on the trip where Ernie took the Nimrod behind the Vulcan for the first time. And I'd never seen air-to-air refueling before. And in we went, stabilised and plugged into the tanker and backed out and did all the things that you do when you, on the initial phase 1 of the tanking. And we dropped away, and we didn't realise at the time that that was the first time a frontline pilot had gone behind the Victor.
Vulcan.
And he was, bang, first time. And his comments were, because it was so smooth, I think this is really a nice tanker. I think it'll do well in the Air Force. And of course it never made him roll because it wasn't a requirement. quite an eye-opening trip, constantly. But he went after the GSU back to St Morgan. He was repatriated to the Cornish lands and on the OCU. And I think Art will probably tell us. Chris, you start?
Yeah.
We've got a few stories from the OCU now.
Leading on from Vulcans, Ernie was captain on the crew that I was with, or he captained this particular flight. And it was behind a Vulcan in November '82, still doing his training, and we actually broke a probe on that one. Ernie wasn't in control, I think the student was, but anyway, we lost the probe on that one, and subsequently my crew lost the probe in the middle of the South Atlantic somewhere. Martin Christie in control then. But yeah, Ernie was a really, from a navigator's point of view, on the OCU, I flew 2 tours with him. Obviously on the OCU you interchange pilots and rear crew quite a lot there, but he was always known as a really safe pair of hands. You could always rely on Ernie, no dramas at all anywhere. He would always get you back into St Morgan here when the weather factor was not always favourable to you. One occasion on the OCU we had a Jibex down to Gibraltar, student crew, student pilot in the left-hand seat, Ernie in the right there. We took off on 09 and instantly we got airborne, really heavy vibration from one of the inboard engines. Ernie, I have control, calm, collected, heavy aircraft from Jib. Took over and I'm not sure whether we dumped fuel, but we landed back on anyway, and it was no drama, probably 15-20 minutes of flight, that's all. Landed back on there. aircraft put in dispersal, and analysis, why has the engine failed? It turned out that there's a little hatch that covers part of the toilet system in the Nimrod, and that hatch had actually blown off and been sucked down the engine. Ernie, in the 700, part of the shit system hit the fan system.
Legion. John's got another OCU story.
Getting stiff, I think it must be old age or something.
No, it can't be that.
Right,
Can't be that.
picture, if you will, Greenwood in Nova Scotia on a sunny afternoon. And we are there, part of the Nimrod display, as part of the Air Day, I think it was probably Labour Day, for Canadian Air Force Base in Greenwood. Anyway, we're sort of lined up, ready to go. We'd had a quiet afternoon, relaxed, ready for the display. And as we were sitting on the piano keys, the tower said, excuse me guys, yes? The guy who's coming after you has just scrubbed, can you do an extra 6 or 7 minutes please? Now, in the doyen of aircrew displays, have you rehearsed it? Have you practiced it? If the answer is no, you don't bloody well do it. Anyway, I said, all right, we'll give it a go. So I was doing the commentary for the display on the ground and from the back seat, from the back of the airplane. So I delivered that. Our 6-minute display went on a fine. And after that was complete, thank you very much, I'll go up the back and watch what we're going to do as we sort of, what we're going to do, Ernst? He said, well, Anyway, as we went around at low level, in steep turns, and Ernie always had a civilization. And he's there, as we were going around, tight turns, with the stick shift was nibbling at the controls. And the ash kept dropping off there. And John Rudin was in the other seat. And at one point, it did require both of them heaving on the poles to go around the corner. And I remember to this my dying day, John Rudin saying, Ernie, we're getting too bloody old for this game. And that was it, we landed, that was all done. To continue with the refueling thing, again, I used to like to stand at the back of the flight deck and watch this happening. And I was there when the other squad leader Banfield, who I believe was called Tony Banfield, who had come to actually teach Ernie how to do tanking. And the two of them, chaps of a certain age, similar experience, both very experienced. This guy was a test pilot. And he said, right, we'll crack on and do it. One of the things that he said, you are not supposed to do, he said, you're not supposed to plug in a turn. He said, however, you can. So as and there's a racetrack over the Cairn Gorge, we went round and round behind this VC-10 tanker. He said, right, yeah, in the turn, so many angles, degrees of bank, plug in, unplug, plug in, unplug, plug in, unplug, all the way around. He said, it's a piece of dough, really. I don't know why the rule says you can't, but there we go. And then we came to, on one of the straight lines, going down, and what was known in the trade as a hard hose, i.e., when our probe made contact with the basket, it sort of pushed it all in a little bit into the tanker aircraft, and then it would unwind again. With a hard hose, it didn't go in, and you could see this ripple going up this long hose. And he said, you need to watch this carefully, and he said, it'll go up there, and it's going to come back down the line, back down the hose line, very quickly. He said, just before it gets in the basket, unplug, the hose lashed up and down, and you plug back in again, straight away. He said, we won't practice that, however. It just shows you can't do it. But it was, for the next, 3 months, we watched Ernst in a green bag every day, multiple hours. And I was so pleased eventually that he got formal recognition for it. But he was the kind of guy, as Pete Hawke said, I really liked flying with Ernie. He was such a nice chap. And we wish we had more of them. Anyway.
I think we've got a tale from closer to home, St Morgan, which I think Richard Gates is going to mention, as he was a navigator on a particularly interesting sortie that took place in St Morgan. Again, OCU times.
Thanks, mate. Yes, I was on the OCU for about 3 years before I moved up to Ops, and I flew a few times with Ernie. But the most memorable time, and this will be short and sweet, the most memorable time was the last of his days on the OCU at for that particular tour. We went off and did some local training just over there, not very far away, and it was time to come back home, so we did, and Ernie just said to us, going to do a slightly unusual recovery. Okay. And the next thing we knew was we were coming up the valley over there, and we flew all the way up the main drag, and when we got to the top of the hill, we put the power on, and off we went up into the wild blue above. And that was really all I can remember about it. But Ernie was such an easy chap to fly with, and a great guy. Anyway, just a little while ago, I was over at the corner of the bar listening to some other people, and QB was one of the people talking, and he can add a little perspective, if I can ask him to do so, of what happened on the ground, because I had no idea what was going on down here, but QB was relating this story about the reactions down here on the surface.
I was on the aeroplane with her at the time. I got up to Ops about an hour before we were due to go to the aeroplane, and he was fuming. The usually placid Ernie was really steaming, and I said, "What on earth's the matter?" He said, "Oh, those bastards in headquarters, they've sent my travel claim back for the 3rd time. I'm going to show them." You're really silly, are you, Ernie? Yes, he said, "Yeah, I'm a bloody show them." Anyway, we got airborne, and as Dick says, he went round, he came up the main drag here, obviously about 200 feet, but it was probably a bit lower. Full power, over station headquarters, and I understand that to a man and woman in the headquarters, they dived under their desks. And the next morning, Ernie was in front of our AOC, the CNC, what's his name? Sir John Harris. What's his nickname?
Win.
He was in front of Win Harris in his #1 uniform, and Win said, "For God's sake, Ernie, what can I say to a 60-year-old spec aircrew squadron leader who behaves like a schoolboy?" "Nothing, sir. Get out."
I hadn't heard that version of the story, I must admit. I didn't know that people were diving under desks. So, anyway, we're coming up to Ernie's 60th birthday. This is that sort of period. And of course the OCU moved north again. So it did seem like an appropriate time to actually retire. And of course he did retire into the local area, where he'd been for many, many, many years. And he was invited to join Probus, which was quite a gathering, I understand, about once a month. And he declined that. His loving daughters bought him a complete set of play yourself golf, clothes and boots and gloves and balls. They didn't really enjoy that tour. He did maintain a lifelong interest in football, so he was able to enjoy that during his time. And he moved north up after Edna died, because there was a flood of the biblical proportions in the house while he was away dealing with family affairs. And that was a clear signal that it's probably time to move. And he moved up to a place called Wheatley in Devon, which is positioned halfway between where Linda was moving to and where Donald Wimley still lives. So the girls could keep an eye on him. As I said earlier, Ernie was Mr. Nimrod. All of us who knew and worked with him are better for the experience. I would like to say just a few more words, but I think they're probably better said by anybody who would like to. And I think Dick wants to say it, and
little something.
Thanks.
Unfortunately, I don't have any tales of daring do to tell you because, as people have said, flying with Ernie was usually very unremarkable. His handling, as everyone agrees, is extremely smooth. What nobody has said, of course, is his thought processes. And the art of flying is very much in thinking ahead of the aeroplane. And Ernie was so far ahead of the aeroplane, he was in the crossbar drinking his first pint, and the rest of us were doing the after takeoff tests. Because I never had any serious incidents with Ernie, doesn't mean that we didn't have some interesting ones. And he did upset my equilibrium one day. It was during a tachyval, and I seemed to find myself crewed up with Ernie, often on tachyvals. And we'd been airborne for a while, and the exercise was declared over. But for some reason we weren't allowed to dump fuel that day. And my plan to do a coastline recce at 200 feet with the air brakes out at maximum speed was quickly vetoed by Ernie. And we finished up back in the St. Albans circuit. And so I had flying circuits, and I was wondering, you know, I'd done about 3 normal circuits. You never just do normal circuits for those who are not experienced in this field. You try and make them a bit more interesting by changing the aircraft configuration to situations that you might experience on a rare day. In fact, I don't think they've ever happened, have they? But they could. So I was waiting for Ernie to say, oh, let's do one with the air brakes out, or let's do a flapless, or I'll just fail a couple of engines on you, we'll do a 2-engine approach. And it didn't happen. And I kept flying round and round doing these ordinary circuits, and I think, what am I doing wrong? I must be doing something wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't keep me doing these ordinary circuits. So I kept making tiny adjustments to these circuits, and I can tell you, by circuit number 10, they were perfect. Absolutely nothing wrong with them. And I begin to get very nervous now as to when these 2 engines were going to get shut down. But they never did. I logged 15 landings in my logbook that day after that sortie. We went back to the crossbar, and I said to Ernie, he said, Ernie, why do we just do normal circuits all the time? He said, oh, I was really enjoying it. I think from the twinkle in his eye, he knew exactly what he was doing. But just to summarise, yes, we all agree, he was a wonderful pilot. I loved flying. I looked forward to flying with Ernie for 2 reasons. Because I knew I was going to learn a lot, and I was going to enjoy it tremendously. And he never let me down in that regard. He was a wonderful man, and I'm very sad that he's left us. But what a wonderful legacy he's left behind, as we've heard today. So thank you, Donna, and your sisters, for laying on this occasion and giving us the opportunity to say how much we loved your father, and we did.
Final word for another fine QFI. Art Stacey's going to have a few words.
Thanks, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, it was only when looking through my logbook that I realised that I've known Ernst for 40-odd years, over 40-odd years. And we first came across each other in the early 80s, when we were both returned to maritime, Ernie from his brief diversion into 51 Squadron, and I was returning from a 5-year instructional tour at Cranwell. But it wasn't until about 3 or 4 years later, when I joined the OCU, and Ernst was on already, that I got to know the real Ernie Banfield, the man, the legend. Now, I feel nowadays that words like legend and wow and cool are far too well used. But then I looked in the dictionary, and a legend is a man who, or a woman, who is very famous and admired by a lot of people. And I thought Ernie Banfield was a legend, without a doubt. And then I started looking at the professional pilots, peak room, shortly after Ernie passed away. And there was one word that came out there, almost without exception, and that was gentleman. It's been mentioned on a couple of occasions already this afternoon, and the definition of a gentleman.
is a man of good and courteous conduct. That's Ernie Banfield. He's left us with a legacy, and I've heard Mike already. He talked about never scrub on a fork. I still use expressions, never scrub on a forecast. Shame to take the flying pay. A black cat urinating on velvet. For the ladies, that's a smooth landing. But Ernie could be irritating. He had an irritating habit of setting a power setting at the start of the downwind leg. And then he wouldn't touch those throttles at all. Round finals we would go and the various flap settings would be made. And eventually we arrived over the threshold. Ernie would reach over, close the throttles, and the proverbial cat urinating on a velvet always resulted. I try to emulate that. I think I backed it once in my old Nimrod time. Inevitably though, one time Ernie and I were flying, he set the power setting and I thought, oh God, here we go again. He set the power setting and downwind we went and on finals turn and everything was going fine. And then about 100, 150 feet, he suddenly reached across and he tweaked the throttle. No more than 0.25%, and I can't even remember whether it was up or down. And he made the usual perfect landing. I didn't say anything. He landed, we taxied round. Off into Commerce, we taxied in. I reached across and I said, what happened then on the finals? And he looked across and he winked and he said, the wind must have changed. We had one disagreement in our whole of our 40 years relationship. And that, believe it or not, was caused by a navigator. A certain navigator who unfortunately is not here today, I wish he was, Ian Coleman. It was Ian Coleman's farewell from the OCU. And before that, Ian had had his varicose veins stripped. They were in a terrible state. In fact, we used to joke about his back of his legs looked like a road atlas of the highway and the motorways in Great Britain. But Ian, being Ian, had to do something different on his farewell. And he bought a little Christmas sacking with him, little presents for his fellow instructors on the OCU. When it came to my turn, he produced a kilner jar. And he said, and this one's for Art Stacey. So I came up and he said, who was worried about my varicose veins more than I worried about them myself. And he gave me this small kilner jar. Apparently what he had done was take pieces of pasta, he put them in the kilner jar, he got a bit of tomato ketchup and sorts of that. Then he got some blue dye from somewhere and put that in, then he added water. And I must admit, having never seen any varicose veins in a kilner jar, these look pretty convincing. I took them back to the office. Ernie was the chief instructor in the office and my desk was right by the window, facing there. I put them on the window ledge. Over the next week, we had a gradual process of fermentation. To the extent that the lid on the kilner jar was starting to lift slowly. I thought it was fascinating. I thought we might well be on the verge of a new antibiotic discovery. But no, Ernie took offence to this. He dropped a couple of verbal reminders that perhaps you should get rid of those, and then finally one morning I came in and there was a note from Ernst. And he said, I'm going on a week's leave. When I get back, Ian Coleman's varicose veins are to be gone. And in 40 years, that was our only disagreement. And I'll finish by saying, if there is up there an authorization sheet in the sky, then alongside squadron leader Ernie Banfield, AFC, RAF, gentleman, legend, will be a very, very large DCO. And for the non-acre amongst us, that stands for duty carried out. Ernie, rest in peace. Thank you very much.
Just ends all the experiences and thoughts that have been passed around. There's no doubt about it that Ernie was a legend. It was a gentleman. He never ever made enemies. He only made friends, as I think we're probably seeing today, and many, many, many other places around the world. So I think it only remains for me to say thank you very much to Donna, Linda and Debbie for inviting us here today and making us so welcome. I think some of them have done quite well without us. No joke, I'm very impressed. But thank you very much indeed. And can I say once again, it's been an absolute pleasure and to see Ernst, whose picture just appears right on.